a better theoretical substructure, and more links with genetics and physiology than any other. Hence it seems most likely to serve as an example of how a satisfactory model of personality might ultimately be constructed, i.e. by analogy with E. Other dimensions of personality, such as neuroticism stability or psychoticism superego functioning, are mentioned in the discussion, but only when they overlap or interrelate with E. The book uses E as an example to illustrate the way in which a model of personality can be constructed, but it is in no way a summary of all that is known about E. Instead of reviewing the huge experimental literature which has grown up around this concept, a task which is becoming every day more and more impossible, we have concentrated on a few key issues, and given a thorough discussion of those important areas on which he has impinged: psychophysiology, conditioning, memory, and learning, social behavior, and the like. These areas are important for an empirical definition of E, for an understanding of its construct validity, and for a causal analysis of its theoretical underpinnings. Of particular importance in this connection is the chapter on heredity, which links psychological variables with underlying physiological and anatomical ones. The book is informed by an underlying belief that personality is a fundamental concept in psychology, and that no experimental or applied psychology can flourish which does not incorporate concepts related to personality, such as traits, aptitudes, attitudes, etc. Psychology always deals with people, and people are above all else individuals, i.e. they behave differently in identical situations. Hence all laws based on regularities of behavior have to be modified by reference to those aspects of human nature which produce differences, and the development of laws governing the interactions of these individual differences with the observed generalities is a vital component of a scientific psychology. In the past, the experimental psychologists have tended to go their own way, leaving the task of bringing order into the field of individual differences to psychometrists, personologists, and others interested in classification, correlations, and nosology. Conversely, those interested in individual differences and personality have tended to 12. Introduction. Disregard the concepts and laws of experimental psychology, and have tried to construct a science of personality in disregard of what had been accomplished in the broader area. I believe that both sides were fundamentally wrong in trying to go their own way. Only by working together are they likely to build up a proper science of psychology, theoretically thriving and practically useful. It is for this reason that I believe that the model for personality here offered is of importance for the development of psychology. It demonstrates, on the one hand, that experimental psychology cannot do without taking individual differences into account. By doing this, it throws away a vital part of the total experimental variance and unduly enlarges the error variance, which in psychology is usually already much too large. And on the other hand, it demonstrates that by using concepts and methods of experimental psychology, those interested in personality and individual differences can acquire important conceptual tools for constructing a theoretical system which can link the two fields, which can enable them to make testable predictions, and which alone makes possible the establishment of a proper causal theory of personality. These are important possibilities, and in trying to establish the fact that they are based on firm empirical evidence, I venture to suggest that if what I have just said can be justified, then we are indeed here dealing with a model for personality, a model which is worthy of being extended to other areas of personality. The contributors to this book have been selected on the basis of their expertise in the various fields represented, and their contribution to these fields. They have all been admonished to be critical as well as constructive in their comments and conclusions. Like all scientific theories, that linking E to cortical arousal encounters many anomalies. This book attempts to stress the existence of anomalies as much as the apparent successes of the theory. As Claude Bernard once said, scientific concepts are not right or wrong, they are useful or useless. If the concepts employed herein are found useful, and I believe that few readers will dispute this, then we may hope that further work will clarify the apparent anomalies and extend the theory to areas hitherto not considered in sufficient detail. Indeed, the existence of anomalies proves that a theory is in fact scientific. Only unfalsifiable theories are without such anomalies, and unfalsifiable theories are by definition outside the scientific pale. This does not mean that we should be proud of such anomalies, and cherish them forever. We should make every effort to clarify the issues, look at different parameters, and try in every way to see if the apparent anomalies cannot be made to conform to our theories, or else we may have to modify our theories in order to incorporate the anomalies. All this is part of the problem-solving aspect of normal science, as Kuhn has emphasized. The tremendous growth of interest in this paradigm, and the equally notable increase in research effort devoted to such extension and clarification suggest that the next few years will see a considerable improvement in these aspects of the theory which are still a little hazy. Perhaps the next edition of this book will contain the answer to many puzzles which are still with us at the time of writing. Until then we can only present the theory, warts and all, as it stands at the moment. Readers interested in finding promising research projects will find plenty in the following pages. The theory is by no means finished, even in its major outlines. Nothing would give me greater satisfaction than to find that the book had stimulated keen and eager young scientists to test and if possible disprove some of the hypotheses here discussed. This is the greatest success that a scientific theory can have. 1.1 Models and Explanations. The problem dealt with in this book was raised in a classical query over 2,000 years ago by Theophrastus, in his book Characters, written when he was 99 years old. Why is it that while all Greece lies under the same sky and all the Greeks are educated alike, yet we all have characters differently constituted? Individuality in human beings is so pronounced, and variability so common, that many have despaired of finding any scientific basis for constructing a model of personality. Allport, 1937. Has given a clear discussion of the many problems raised. The ancient Greeks suggested an answer in terms of traits and types. The theory of the four temperaments which they put forward has lasted longer than perhaps any other psychological theory, but of course it is open to many criticisms. Can modern psychology do any better? A glance at recent textbooks does not suggest any very confident affirmative answer, e.g. Hall and Lindsay 1957, London and Exner 1978, Maher 1970. What we find is a long list of different theorists, putting forward entirely different views and hypotheses, using entirely different measures, and even types of measures. This is a far cry from the sort of paradigm that we are told characterizes science. Kuhn 1962. There is not even sufficient agreement for a revolutionary to rebel against. All there seems to be is a multitude of approaches in search of a unifying principle. The prevailing mood seems to be one of excessive eclecticism. In the words of Feyerabend, 1975, anything goes. There is indeed an honoured and honourable meaning to the term, eclecticism. It denotes an attitude of impartiality, a refusal to become committed too readily and prematurely, a desire to examine all sides of a problem and to review all the evidence, even where it seems to go counter to one's cherished theories. But it may also mean an easy acceptance of all types of view, good, bad and indifferent, a refusal to exert one's critical faculties or to pass judgments on the adequacy or otherwise of theories and experiments apparently supporting or disproving these theories, a lazy recognition that there is some good in all theories and a fatalistic acceptance of the rules of the Quercus race all have won, and all must have prizes. It is the latter type of eclecticism which is so prevalent in this field, and it is an attitude that is fatal to a proper scientific study of any topic. The resulting mood of disenchantment seems all-pervasive. If we cannot judge objectively between rival theories, then clearly we shall never achieve the status of a science. If we refuse to elaborate criteria for accepting or rejecting theories, then the achievement of a paradigm in Kuhn's sense becomes impossible. I shall attempt, in this first chapter, to suggest criteria which may be useful in judging scientific models of personality. The rest of the book will be devoted to a review of the literature concerning a particular model, with special reference to the manner in which the model stands up to scrutiny, using these criteria. I believe that it is possible to decide between competing alternations along the usual lines of scientific investigation, and that a paradigm does exist even in this complex and difficult field, imperfect and incomplete, but viable and promising. It is hoped that the contents of the following chapters will enable readers to judge the correctness or otherwise of this statement for themselves. What is that we seek when we study personality? What do we mean we seek for an explainer? General features of the model. Tyon, Craig 1952, of observed individual differences or try to construct a model, Hesser 1966, to help us visualize the complex of explanations contained in a theory. Essentially, we search for concepts, Jammer 1954, 1957, which will help us reduce the infinitude of observed events to a small number of variables tied together by rules or laws. Ideally, these concepts and laws should enable us to predict future events and to understand, post-dict, past events. Explanations must not be too broad. It is not enough to say that a person's conduct is the product of his heredity and his past experiences. We must clearly specify much more closely the laws of heredity in question. Is there dominance, a sort of mating, epistasis? How much of the phenotypic variation is explained by additive genetic variants, etc.? And we must state precisely and unambiguously just what environmental events produce just what types of behavior. But above all, we need intervening variables, concepts of the nature of traits, types, abilities, attitudes, and what not else that is measurable and can be used to characterize a given person. Such an approach is often called nomothetic and contrasted with a different, ideographic approach. The latter is literary rather than scientific, intra-individual rather than inter-individual. Geisteswissenschaftlich rather than naturwissenschaftlich. Typical of this approach are Existen Theorist schools, phenomenologists, and many types of dynamic psychology. It is not our purpose here to discuss or criticize the ideographic approach or to point out the non-scientific nature of such theories as the Freudian or Jungian. This task has been undertaken by others. Popper 1959, Lakatos and Musgrave 1970, Sub 1974, more versed in the philosophy of science, Eysenck and Wilson, 1973, may also be consulted. What we have attempted in this book is the construction of a scientific model of personality, using the term scientific in its classical sense. Admittedly, the demarcation dispute, i.e. the question of how precisely to separate science from non-science, is by no means settled, but there is much agreement on many essential elements, Sub 1974, Lakatos 1976, even though some maverick philosophers, such as Feyerabend, 1975, still believe the whole endeavour to be misplaced. There are three main contestants in the ring: Baconian inductionism, the verification principle of the Vienna School, and the falsification principle of Popper. It has always seemed to me that all three principles have a positive contribution to make, and that they are complementary rather than exclusive. In particular, it seems to me that we must see these principles as relevant at different stages in the development of a scientific theory. Figure 1.1 illustrates this view. At an early stage of development, we are reduced to fact collecting on the basis of vague hunches, serendipitous discoveries of unforeseen regularities, and inductive generalizations. When sufficient data have been collected along these lines, we are in the position of being able to put forward hypotheses of relatively small compass, and now the emphasis shifts to verification. Unless we can verify these hypotheses, at least within the confines of certain parameter values, it is unlikely that they will be pursued further or interest other scientists. Given that this stage is successfully passed, we enter the realm of theory-making proper, and now falsification becomes the most important aspect of our experimental work. When a given theory is firmly established, it becomes a scientific law, and now the paradigm has become settled. Only a revolution, sparked off by the accumulation of anomalous findings, and the emergence of an alternative theory, will dethrone such a theory. Thus what constitutes a scientific approach will depend on the degree of development of a particular field. Too rigorous a demand at too early a stage may well prevent the proper development of a discipline from ever taking place, just as too lenient a requirement at a later stage of development will prevent the discipline from growing up and assuming its rightful place. I would suggest that the theory here developed is entering into the third stage, i.e. theorem-making proper. This is the stage where the notion of the paradigm becomes appropriate. Such a view may be criticized as unduly optimistic. Readers will have an opportunity to study the evidence for themselves and thus answer the question by the use of their own criteria. I would merely venture to suggest that the answer has important implications for the future devel. Models and explanations. 3. Alternative theory. Falsification. Verification. Figure 1.1. Demarcation theories of science, a unified point of view. Upment of research in the field of personality. It has become almost a joke to see the proliferation of concepts and tests in the personality field. Boris, 1970, reviews hundreds if not thousands in his compendium, and of the making of further tests there is no end. Unless we are to end up in mindless eclecticism, we must at least attempt to reach some sort of consensus on criteria and, if possible, on concepts. Without such agreement, the psychology of personality. Observation induction. Hunch. Hypothesis. Theory. Lore. 2. Personality traits can be identified by means of correlational, factor analytical studies. 3. Personality traits are importantly determined by hereditary factors. 4. Personality traits are measurable by means of questionnaire data. 5. The interactive influence of traits and situations produces transient internal conditions, known as states. We'll never reach the tilde tatus of a science. The development of the model here advocated, in its historical context, is briefly discussed in the next section. As already mentioned, it embodies the Greek concepts of traits and types, and as. These concepts have themselves recently been criticized as inappropriate. Miss J 11968, 1977. It may be useful here to discuss briefly the major characteristics of these concepts and the main answers to the criticisms made of them. A more detailed review of the topic has appeared elsewhere. Eysenck and Eysenck 1980. The essence of the criticism was put forward most forcefully many years ago by Thorndike, 1903, when he stated that there are no broad, general traits of personality, no genera, and consistent forms of conduct which, if they existed, would make for consistency of behavior and stability of personality, but only independent and specific stimulus-response bonds or habits. In opposition, it is maintained that the following 8 statements of the state trait position are supported by so much evidence that they can be regarded as definitely established. 1. Individuals differ with respect to their location on important semi-permanent personality dispositions, known as traits. 6. Personality states are measurable by means of questionnaire data. 7. Traits and states are intervening variables or mediating variables that are useful in explaining individual differences in behavior to the extent that they are incorporated into an appropriate theoretical framework. 8. The relationship between traits or states and behavior is typically indirect, being affected or moderated by the interactions that exist among traits, states, and other salient factors. The essential point here is that the concept of trait demands consistency of conduct, whereas Thorndike's and Miskell's view seems to be that such consistency is largely missing. There was much discussion of this point in the 30s and 40s, and a large literature grew up in this connection, starting with the important work of Hartshorne and May, 1928, 1929, and Hartshorne and Shuttleworth, 1930. All this work has been extensively reviewed by Eysenck, 1970a, and the conclusion was that consistency rather than inconsistency was the order of the day, even in those studies which at first sight seemed to come to opposite conclusion, like the Hartshorne, May, and Shuttleworth experiments. Miskell, 1969, clearly disagrees, when he writes. 4. General features of the model. I am more and more convinced, however, hopefully by data as well as on theoretical grounds, that the observed inconsistency so regularly found in studies of non-cognitive personality dimensions often reflects the state of nature, and not merely the noise of measurement. The basis for this assertion was the partial review of the relevant literature by Miskell, 1968, from which he concluded that measures of consistency in personality rarely produce correlations as high as 0.30. There are many criticisms of this conclusion. Eysenck and Eysenck 1980. Here we shall only mention briefly some of the main ones. 1. Limited and unreliable data sampling vitiates many studies. Epstein, 1977, showed that consistency of moods was only 0.20 when computed on a database of 2 days, but rose to 0.88 when a longer database was used. 2. Limited and unreliable tests. The Hartshorne, May, and Shuttleworth studies found correlations of 0.2 or thereabouts between individual objective classroom tests. These rose to respectable heights when combined into batteries of 9 individual tests, giving predictive accuracies of 0.5 to 0.6 against teachers' ratings of honesty. 3. Poor and unreliable criteria. Predictions are limited in accuracy by the reliability of the criterion. Criteria, even in cognitive fields, are often grossly unreliable. Hartog and Rhodes 1936, and even more so in the personality field. All these factors produce noise, and measurements must be corrected for attenuation before conclusions can be drawn. 4. If personality variables account for only 9% of the variance. Situations only account for 10%. Saracen et al. 1975. If one adopts very stringent criteria for the minimal percentage of the variance that a factor must account for in order to warrant further consideration, then there is danger that researchers will discover that no factors at all are sufficiently important to consider. 5. Moderator variables, Wallach 1962, are important in personality research, but Miskell disregards them as reducing the generality of the trait approach. Yet if the situation is complex enough to demand moderator variables to account for this complexity, we cannot avoid using them. 6. Miskell averages consistency coef. Efficients over good and bad, successful and unsuccessful studies. This is meaningless. If one good, carefully researched study based on reasonable theoretical predictions gives a consistency of 0.8, this is not negated because another scruffy, poorly designed study based on no theoretical foundations gives a consistency of surprised face. 7. Consistency may involve more than one factor, thus antisocial behavior correlates positively with psychoticism, neuroticism, and extroversion in children, Eysenck 1977a. Each factor by itself only contributes a relatively small amount of variance, but in some they make prediction possible with a much greater degree of accuracy. 8. Interaction between personality and situation accounts for a respectable additional amount of variance. Such interaction is largely discounted by Miskell, but must realistically be taken into account, Magnuson and Endler 1977. Interaction typically accounts for another 20% of some of the variance. To make this possible, personality must be a consistent variable, Bowers 1973, Saracen et al. 1975. These and other criticisms of Miskell's position, given in more detail elsewhere, Eysenck 1970a, Eysenck and Eysenck 1980, reduce the force of its impact. He is right, of course, in applying his critical mind to the customary type of personality research, in which some multiphasic questionnaire, often chosen more or less at random, MMPI, CPI, 16PF, is applied to a population which is also given some other test, or which is rated or measured on some behavioral or experimental variable, without any theoretical expectation of what might be found. Of the resulting 20 correlations, I is almost certain to be significant by chance, and with luck some of the observed correlations may be reasonably high. However, these multiphasic scales usually only measure a much smaller number of underlying variables, thus, Nichols and Schnell, 1963, have shown that the CPI measures essentially only two variables, neuroticism and extroversion, to use our terms, and Reynolds and Nichols, 1977, have shown that these two variables carry the full burden of prediction, with the specific variance of the original scales contributing nothing. This sort of situation again makes Miskell's type of averaging meaningless, if the CPI predicts. Models and explanations. 5. Some type of behavior, then the resulting coefficient of correlation would be divided by the total number of scales used, and the outcome would be very different depending on whether we chose the number of CPI scales as the denominator, or the two scales which carry the whole burden of predictive validity. The position here taken would seem to derive some support from the consensus of opinion in Magnuson and Endler's 1977 book, but it may be necessary to look in detail at the alternative view to Miskell's which they offer in their advocacy of interactional psychology. They argue that within traditional personality psychology, it is possible to distinguish among three conceptions of molar individual behavior: the trait model, the PSY, dynamic model, and the situation-ism model. The trait model and the psychodynamic model have in common their stress on personal actors as the main determinants of behavior. Situation-ism, in contrast, examines the environment to find the important factors that determine the behaviors of individuals. Research within this model has aimed at finding general laws for behavioral reactions as functions of the kind and intensity of external stimulation. Magnuson and Endler go on to state that on the basis of some empirical research of their own, a fourth model, called an interactionist model, has been formulated. A basic element in this model is the focus on the ongoing multidirectional interaction between an individual and his or her environment, especially the situations in which behavior occurs. Persons and situations are regarded as indispensably linked to one another during the process of interaction. Neither the person factors nor the situation factors per se determine behavior in isolation. It is determined by inseparable person by situa. Taiwan interactions. This view has an immediate intuitive appeal, but the alternatives are unreal and incorrectly perceived and presented. Person theories have never been suggested as being independent of situations. The very names of the traits often researched, suggestibility, sociability, impulsiveness, conditionability, vigilance, explicitly contain mention of the situation suitable for evoking and measuring these hypothetical traits. A vigilance situation could never be used to measure conditioning, suggestibility, or sociability. Similarly, a typical condi tining situation could never be used to measure suggestibility or sociability. Thus person theories automatically include an interactionist type implication of suitable situations for measurement and evocation in the statement of the traits involved. Similarly, it would be to misrepresent Miskell to state that he completely rejects individual differences in his situationist theory. He simply regards variance due to individual differences as unlikely to equal importance of situational variables. In a very real sense, both Miskell and person theorists are interactionists. They can be differentiated by their position along a continuum at the x. Tremes of which lie the positions of Thorndike, who really seems to have held the views attributed by Magnuson and Endler to situationists, and those of some hypothetical but non-existent person theorists who completely disregarded the importance of situations. Such a position would be meaningless and self-contradictory, and in reality modern person theorists and situation theorists are much closer together, somewhere in the middle of the hypothetical continuum, differing in a quantitative, but not a qualitative, manner. Thus Magnuson and Endler are not advocating a third possibility, but are simply recognizing the same inevitable conjunction of person and situation as producing behavior which person theorists and situation theorists also recognize. The quarrel, if there is one, is about the general size of the contribution by person and situation factors, and this question is by its nature unanswerable, depending on the precise details of the experiment, and varying in dependence on the extreme. Nature of the situation, the variance in personality type, the measures used, the value of the theories tested, and many other factors. The whole debate is largely semantic. It would never occur to physicists to ask whether predictions about the behavior of elements or alloys depended more on their atomic constitution or the external influences, changes in temperature, pressure, electrolysis, etc., to which they were exposed. They would rightly regard the whole question as meaningless. Clearly some form of interactionism is implied in the very definition of physical change, as it is in relation to human behavior. 6. General features of the model. Ultimately, of course, the argument as it applies to the concepts used in this book must be settled by reference to the experiments employing these concepts. The most important studies have been reprinted in book form elsewhere, Ising 1970b, 1976a. These books cover a much wider field than that covered in this volume. The literature has grown so enormously in recent years that no complete coverage will be possible, and consequently we have concentrated on a few fields where sufficient material was available to make reasoned judgment possible. Consistency should be looked at not only in the psychometric sense adopted by Miskell. Much more important in our view is the consistency between theoretical prediction and experimental verification. It is with this latter type of consistency that we shall be dealing in the main. The psychometric interpretation will be dealt with only in parsing. What is the nature of the theory here discussed? We shall only state very briefly the outlines and main tenets of the theory, partly because it has been stated at much greater length elsewhere, Ising 1967, Ising and Ising 1969, 1976, and partly because relevant parts will be restated by individual authors in this book at the appropriate place. Essentially, the theory asserts that human personality can be described in terms of traits, such as sociability, impulsiveness, activity, worrisomeness, carefreeness, etc., which are intercorrelated and form higher-order superfactors. The three main superfactors have been variously named by different investigators, but will here be called E, X. Travers ion tilde introversion, N, neuroticism tilde stability, and P, psychoticism tilde superego. These FAC TORs, or others remarkably similar to them, have been found over and over again in many different studies, Royce 1973, and may even be isolated in animals, Chamouve et al. 1972, Broadhurst 1975. These factors have a strong genetic basis, Ising 1976b, and psychophysiological theories have been elaborated, linking E with the reticulocortical arousal loop, N with the limbic system, visceral brain, and P with the androgen hormone system, Ising 1967, Ising and Ising 1976. These factors make possible predictions in the experimental, social, educational, psychiatric, criminological, and other fields, Ising 1976a, Ising and Wilson 1978, Ising and Rachman 1965, Ising 1977b. There are specific hypotheses, such as that the reticulocortical arousal loop is not independent of the limbic system, so that any activation of the laner will be shown up in the heightened arousal consequent in the former, whereas there is no reciprocal relation of this kind, Ising 1967. Pharmacological agents affect behavior in predictable ways, depending on the personality type involved, Broadhurst 1978, and so does brain damage, Ising 1967. The range of possible predictions is therefore very wide, and verification or disproof of the theory can be looked for in many different directions. This book will be concerned largely with a review of the strictly experimental literature in psychophysiology, conditioning, learning, and memory, brain damage and drug effects, but one chapter has been devoted to the broader social field. 1.2 The development of a paradigm. A paradigm may be expected to have a developmental history, even though it may have arisen in one man's brain. Nevertheless, it must have had precursors, and after its birth must go through many stages before being widely accepted. So, with the model here discussed, I believe that an adequate understanding of the problems in this field, and the attempted solutions as well, is impossible without some knowledge of the history and development of the psychological theories of personality. There are, roughly speaking, 12 periods of development, each associated with an outstanding personality whose work marked a definite advance. It may be useful if these 12 advances are defined in some detail. It is often said that psychology has a long past, but a short history. This is equally true of the study of personality. The moment when intuitive understanding, philosophical speculation, and clinical intuition, which constituted the past, gave way to experimental study, psychological theory, and psychometric. The development of a paradigm. 7. Analysis can be defined more easily here than in most other areas of psychology. The Turing parent is associated with the extremely original and fundamental work of a man whose very name is probably unknown to most psychologists, even those who are actively working in the field of personality study. This man was the Dutch philosopher and psychologist G. Heymans, 1857 to 1930, who published his views and results in book form in 1929, but who had written his fundamental papers, with E. Wiersma and H. Brugmans, Heymans, and Wiersma 1906 to 1909, some 20 years earlier. We shall see in a minute just why it is he, rather than others, who are more often named and who are better known to English-speaking psychologists, who may be said to mark the transition point from unscientific past to scientific history. 1. The story begins. If the human search for an understanding of personality, individual differences, temperamental peculiarities, and other deviations from the strictly average sort of behavior can in any real sense be said to have a beginning with Galen, a Greek physician who lived in the 2nd century AD and who was widely credited with the enunciation of the doctrine of the four temperaments. The notions of the melancholic, the choleric, the sanguine, and the phlegmatic, shorn of the associated theory of the humours which were believed to cause their striking differences, have passed into everyday language, and the man in the street still uses these phrases in characterizing certain types of behavior. As we shall see. The theory of extroversion-introversion is intimately connected with this ancient theory, ridiculous only to those who do not realize that it embodies a large slice of excellent clinical observation, without which it would never have been accepted or have lasted longer than any other psychological theory. This is not the place to go into the vexed question of Galen's originality in this respect, or to discuss possible prior claims of Hippocrates and others. I am not sufficiently expert to discuss these questions, and for the purposes of this book they are not of too great importance. The reader interested in the early development of these theories may with confidence turn to A. A. Roback's Psychology of Character, 1927. 2. The second chapter of our story opens with a contribution made by the great German philosopher and scientist Immanuel Kant in his book on anthropology, which was a kind of textbook of psychology, and in which he brought the doctrine of the four temperaments up to date, popularized it, and made it acceptable to philosophers, physicians, theologians, and other learned men concerned with human personality. Eysenck and Eysenck, 1969, have translated his descriptions of the traits characterizing the four temperaments and have drawn attention to the close relationship between these descriptions and the results of modern factor analytic work in this field. They also point out that the main difference between his views and more modern ones lies in his categorical conception of types as being unchangeable and pure. A person belongs to one of these four groups, he cannot change his position, and there are no intermediate degrees. This notion of types has been rightly criticized by modern American writers, but unfortunately they ascribe such views to more recent writers than Kant, writers who in fact do not hold them, like Lung and Kretschmer. 3. Modern typology parts company with Kant in this respect, and the person who took this important step of translating categorical types into continuous dimensions, and who thus marks our third epoch, was none other than W. Wundt, 1874. His contribution has been discussed elsewhere, Eysenck 1964, and therefore little need be said here other than that he pointed out that cholerics and sanguinics both shared the characteristic of being changeable, while phlegmatics and melancholics were unchangeable. Substitute extrovert and introvert for changeable and unchangeable, and our modern theory, in its descriptive aspects, is born at that he considered a second dimension, emotionality, nowadays often labelled neuroticism or instability, to be formed by the two emotional temperaments, i.e. the choleric and the melancholic, as opposed to the other two, which were considered by him unemotional, and you have a two-dimensional description, continuously variable, of personality, very much as it is given by recent writings of Captel, Guilford, or the present writer. See figure 1.2. 8. General features of the model. Emotional. Suspicious serious. Thoughtful. Egocentric. Hot-headed histrionic active. Unchangeable plus changeable. Reasonable. High, principled controlled. Non-emotional. Wundt, like Heyman's, is seldom if ever mentioned by English-speaking writers on personality, in spite of his very important contribution. Ebbinghaus, too, wrote along rather similar lines. 4. The fourth great contribution comes from O. Gross, 1902-1909, a Viennese physician, who attempted to give a physiological basis to the personality dimension of extroversion-introversion, not then so called, of course, Gross wrote at the beginning of the present century. He conceptualized mental and emotional processes in terms of a primary function, subserving sensation and perception, and a secondary. Figure 1.2. Traits traditionally associated with the four temperaments of Galen, arranged along two major dimensions of person. Alitty. According to Wundt 1874. Ing system, and how both succeeded in describing, by deduction from behavior, something which at that time was far beyond the ken of physiologists and neurologists. Truly, if the reticular formation had not been discovered, it had certainly been invented by psychologists anticipating later developments. 5. We come now to the fifth epoch, and to G. Heyman's and his colleagues. His contribution is threefold, and in each of his innovations he anticipated a large and important area of research. Heyman's 1908, Heyman's and Wiersma 1906, 1907, 1908, 1909. Function, which subserved the perseveration of primary processes. Individuals differed according to the length of the secondary process. Introverts had a long, extroverts a short, secondary process. He showed in fascinating detail how this conception, which tied up with the newly proclaimed theories of perseveration of the memory trace, by Muller and Pilzecker, could be used to account for the personality traits of the two types posited. His physiology is of course entirely speculative, as he himself recognized. It is fascinating to see how he, and later on MacDougall 1929, tried to invent something akin to the ascending reticular activat. A. Psychometric. Heyman's was the first person to realize the importance of quantifying the implicit relationships between traits which had served earlier writers, where they simply observed and noted subjectively what goes with what. In Spearman's phrase, he suggested the use of correlational methods, and worked out a very crude and elementary, but nevertheless useful, coefficient of association. He also worked out methods of grouping such correlations, thus in essence anticipating factor analysis. He was not a gifted mathematician, and curiously enough rejected product moment correlation coefficients for quite the wrong reasons, but he did have an intuitive understanding of the development of a paradigm. 9. The logical requirements of mathematical analysis, and pioneered what are now widely used methods. B. Experimental. He was perhaps the first person to realize that observation of everyday behavior is not sufficient to build a science of personality on, and he carried out experimental studies to measure individual differences in behavior. These are perhaps the first truly to deserve the name of experiments in personality, Galton studies. To take but one example that seems to disprove this generalization, were not experimental in the laboratory sense. C. Hypothetico-deductive method. He realized that science is intimately tied to the use of the hypothetico-deductive method, except perhaps in its first, tentative steps, and he linked the theories of Gross with his psychometric work and his experiments into a nomological network, to use a term which would have been new to him, but the implications of which were apparent in his work. These three major contributions entitle him to be called the father of experimental personality research. Unfortunately, his writings are widely dispersed and do not lend themselves to detailed exposition, but a description, with quotations, of his work has been given in The Structure of Human Personality, Eysenck 1970a. 6. The next claimant for a place in our company of immortals is C.G. Jung, 1933, whose contribution to personality study is often misinterpreted. C. Spearman, in his Classic Abilities of Man, 1927, sums up the work of Heymans, Wiersma, and Brugmans by saying, as so far as scientific status is concerned, this Dutch work stands upon a very high plane. In it mere causal observations, shown over and over again to be grossly misleading, are replaced by most careful and systematic investigations. He goes on to characterize Jung with equal insight. The ideas substantially the same as those mentioned above reappeared not long afterwards in the work of Jung. But the arduous scientific research of his predecessors now gives way to attractive literary embellishment. Jung is often credited with giving a long list of other writers who preceded him in delineating his types of extroversion and introversion. It is interesting that although these types are so very similar to Heymans' carefully researched strong and weak secondary function types, yet Heymans is never mentioned, in spite of the fact that much of his work was published in German and must have been familiar to Jung. If Jung's descriptions are not original, neither is his use of the terms extroversion and introversion. These had times been used in European writings for several hundred years before him. His main claim to originality must be his suggestion that extroversion was linked with a hysterical group of neurotic disorders, introversion with a psychasthenic group, dysthymia, anxiety, reactive depression, phobias, obsessive-compulsive disorders. There appears to be some truth in this observation, and while neurotic typology must be credited to Janet rather than to Jung, nevertheless the identification with normal personality types is important in the historical development of the concept, Eysenck 1947. 7. Related to Jung in that his main concern was with the abnormal counterparts of normal personality types was E. Kretschmer, 1948, but his main contribution did not lie in his identification of extroversion, cyclothymia, with manic depressive insanity and introversion, schizothymia, with schizophrenia. Jung too had thought of schizophrenia as being linked with introversion. The evidence does not suggest that schizophrenia does in fact have such a link. Such a generalization would not now be acceptable, although it must of course be realized that the term schizophrenia means many things to many people, and that its use in modem Anglo-American psychiatry may not be identical with its use in German-speaking circles 50 years ago. However that may be, Kretschmer's continuing fame rests on his insistence on the importance of constitutional factors, and on his insight into the relationship between leptomorphic bodybuild and introversion. See also his American disciple, Sheldon 1940, 1942. While again the evidence regarding bodybuild and insanity, on which he insisted so strongly, is at best inconclusive, there seems to be no doubt that in the normal field at least a relationship of the kind postulated by him exists, although much weaker than he, and Sheldon, who took up his system with minor modifications, believed. Correlations of 0.4 or 10. General features of the model. Thereabouts are the most that can be expected when the elementary errors in conducting such experiments which disfigure his and Eve Tilder Moore Sheldon's work are rectified. Eysenck 1970a. Both Kretschmer and Sheldon contaminated their judgment of temperament and of diagnosis by having knowledge of the bodybuild of the subjects in their studies. This contamination produced unacceptably high correlations, often exceeding the reliabilities of the ratings involved. Furthermore, Kretschmer took little trouble to partial of the effects of age. Later work has shown this to be essential. But constitutional factors are important, as we shall see, and Kretschmer was the first to insist on their importance. 8. The pace now quickens, and our epochs begin to overlap. After Jung, the next great writer to be noted is perhaps C. Spearman, the founder of the London School, a school to end schools, as he once put it, in an attempt to crystallize his belief that the method of factor analysis, which he introduced into psychology, was capable of substituting objective, quantitative type fact for subjective, intuitive belief. Through his students, Webb, Garnett, and Oates, and his collaborators and successors, notably Burt, Stevenson, and Cattell, he exerted a profound influence, and while history remembers him more for his work in intelligence measurement, we must note here that he was the first to demonstrate the existence of the two factors, strictly defined and measured, of emotionality neuroticism, W in his terminology, and of extroversion introversion, C in his terminology. He also tried to elaborate experimental tests of perseveration, with which to measure these personality traits. These were unsuccessful, possibly because he and his students were thinking in terms of psychometric group tests, not in terms of experimental laboratory examinations, given to one person at a time. Whatever the defects of his work, viewed from the vantage point of hindsight, his contribution, substantive and methodological, was crucial in transplanting the Dutch work into English soil, Eysenck 1970a. 9. The contribution of our ninth great figure, J.P. Guilford, can best be understood in terms of the problem which he set out to solve. Briefly, the situation may be summarized by saying that the success of the Woodworth Neuroticism Questionnaire, and the appearance of the English translation of Jung's book, inspired many psychologists in the USA to produce questionnaires of neuroticism and introversion respectively. The largely subjective method used for picking out items and combining them in An essentially arbitrary fashion guaranteed that these measuring instruments measured nothing in particular, and when it was found that neuroticism inventories intercorrelated only about 0.3 with each other, while neuroticism and introversion inventories showed correlations of equal size, it was concluded that this whole approach had been a failure. Vernon, 1938. The bitter taste of this failure survived for a long time, without the realization that it was not due to any faults in theoretical conceptualization or in the principle of questionnaire construction, but rather to inadequacies in the makeup of these particular questionnaires. It is easy to see this now, but at the time many psychologists vowed never again to use personality inventories and never again to think in terms of introversion-extroversion. In many cases this vow survived the Second World War and is only slowly losing its compulsive force. Guilford's great contribution was the realization that the intercorrelations between inventory items and the factor analysis of these intercorrelations constitute indispensable steps in the isolation of stable personality factors and the construction of suitable questionnaires. Guilford also contributed experimental studies which at the time were outstanding examples of the laboratory approach to personality study. If the findings were largely negative, this was perhaps inevitable at the particular stage of development reached at that time by both personality theory and experimental psychology. Guilford et al. 1976. 10. Our 10th author is the Russian writer B. M. Teplov, who has taken up Pavlovian teaching with respect to the strong and weak nervous system, and has built upon this an impressive series of experimental studies of individual differences, ably recounted in English by J. Gray, 1964. It has always seemed to me that Teplov's weak nervous system is analogous to the introverted type, his strong nervous. The development of a paradigm. 11. System to the extrovert type, hence his inclusion in this list. A lengthy discussion of the points of similarity and difference between the two typologies is included in this book, so no more needs to be said on this point. It may be worthwhile, however, to point out the novelty and interest of many of the techniques pioneered by the Russian workers. The stereo typed choice by Western psychologists of such obviously poor measuring instruments as the Rorschach or the MMPI when called upon to investigate personality traits is put to shame by the inventive genius of the Moscow group. Perhaps only Cattell escapes this censure on our side of the fence, because he, too, has attempted, with considerable success, to break out of the bear hug of tradition. The Russian work, too, has its weaknesses, of course, and these may 100m larger to psychometric readers than its strengths, but Teplov's successors are taking great strides to eliminate these weaknesses and the immediate future may benefit greatly from cross-fertilization. 11. We are now nearing the present day, and the work of our next exponent is still very much in progress. Guilford, too, is of course still active at the time of writing, but his interest has shifted to the study of cognitive dimensions and originality. R.B. Cattell has transferred the traditions of the London School to American soil, and has combined exceptional mastery of statistical techniques of multiple factor analysis with large-scale empirical studies employing ratings and self-ratings, and objective, experimental and physiological measurements of the most varied groups. This work goes well beyond the confines of our interests here, but it should be noted that in all his groups the two factors, usually extracted as higher-order factors derived from the intercorrelations between oblique primary factors of extroversion, introversion and neuroticism, called anxiety by him, emerge more clearly and strongly than any others. Cattell and Klein, 1977. Since Cattell is undoubtedly the foremost living exponent of the factor analytic approach, constant verification of the fundamental descriptive hypothesis on which much of the material in this book is based is most valuable and welcome, and the large area of factual agreement between him, Guilford, and the present writer on this point has been documented in great detail elsewhere. Eysenck and Eysenck, 1969. 12. Last, least, and only after much hesitation the writer would place his own contribution. In essence, what he has tried to do has been a continuation of the threefold approach of the Dutch school, as adapted by Spearman and turned by him into a characteristic of the London school. Our psychometric work has been summarized extensively, with much new material, in the description and measurement of personality, Eysenck and Eysenck, 1969. Our experimental work has been similarly summarized in the dynamics of anxiety and hysteria, Eysenck, 1957, and later papers and writings. Our hypothetico-deductive approach can best be studied in the biological basis of personality, Eysenck, 1967, in which an attempt is made to deduce extrovert-introvert differences in behavior, both social and in the laboratory, in terms of differences in cortical arousal, mediated by the reticular formation. The success of these efforts is still too doubtful, and the work itself too recent, to comment on it in any detail. The reader will be able to judge for himself after perusal of the material in this volume. Careful reading of documents straddling 2,000 years of historical development have given rise to some general impressions which may be useful to newcomers to this field. In the first place, there is a strong feeling of historical continuity. Galen's and Kant's observations do not strike the modern observer as ridiculous and outmoded. Our own work may be more extensive, better controlled and statistically more defensible, but it is recognizably a development of ideas mooted all these centuries ago. Gross's and Heyman's speculations about physiological mechanism have little factual substratum, but they are not out of line with what we now know about the structure of the corticoreticular arousal loop and its functioning. Spearman's and Guilford's early factorial studies are now very outdated, but modern methods, aided by computers, do not give results essentially different from theirs. In fact, what we recognize throughout this historical development is the usual scientific progress, slow, step by step, brick by brick, until finally we arrive, almost by stealth. 12. General features of the model. At a splendid, well-built usable structure. So many hands have made their contribution that it becomes difficult to say, he built it. All those who contributed have built it, although some have made a bigger contribution than others. In the second place, there is a feeling that for a long time contributions were made by single people, or at best small groups. Others were slow to take up the contributions made. Heyman's work has been followed up in Holland, and later in South Africa, but is hardly known elsewhere. Even the recent work of Kaptel is carried out mostly by his students and fellow workers, not by the general body of research students. This position is slowly changing. Gradually a more general approach is being elaborated in which theories are being tested in different laboratories all over the world. A third point which may be important is that personality study is beginning to cease to be the prerogative of a small set of psychologists who happen to be interested in individual differences, while the great body of experimental and theoretical psychologists goes its own way, profoundly unmoved by whatever may be going on in this small comer. If extroverts and intro. Verts differ in their habitual arousal level, as well as in their sensory thresholds, orienting reactions, adaptation rates, EEG, EMG, and GSR response patterns, rates of conditioning, perceptual after-effects, and 1001 psychological and physiological measures. Then it ceases to be practical for the experimentalist to proclaim his disinterest in personality, and relegate individual differences to the error term in his analysis of variance, interaction terms, embodying. Personality in the form of extrovert-introvert differences become extremely important and should be extracted from any well-planned study, even when personality differences are not the main point of interest. I have discussed this point at some length elsewhere, ISINC 1969, and will not insist on it here at any greater length. It is my impression that the lesson is gradually being learned, and that more and more hard-bitten experimentalists are taking individual differences into account. It is unfortunate in this connection that the terms extroversion and introversion are in many people's minds linked so closely with the pewter. Tie farther of this personality typology, E.G. Jung. From the point of view of scientific study, his contribution has been largely a negative one. By allowing his mystical notions to overshadow the empirical, observational data, he has done his best to remove the concept of personality type from the realm of scientific discourse. His extremely complex system, involving foot functions arranged in contrasting pairs, all of which can be extrovert or introverted, and which compensate each other in a complex manner in which conscious extroversion may be linked with unconscious introversion, has not found much favor with even his more devoted followers, as he once pointed out when questioned on whether a given person was extrovert or introverted. In the last analysis I decide who is an extrovert and who is an introvert. This splendid assertion of faith mirrors Göring's famous statement when someone pointed out that his personal favorite, Luftwaffe General Milch, was in fact Jewish. I decide who is a Jew. But it proves somewhat less attractive to scientists who are attempting to construct a universal, objective science of personality structure and measurement. Psychologists will have to learn the plain historical fact that the personality types of extroversion and introversion owe very little to Jung, and the sooner this message reaches psychological textbooks the better. It is interesting that the first appearance of the term extroversion in an English dictionary, appropriately enough, is in Dr. Johnson's Dictionary of the English Language, which appeared in 1755. It does not tell us very much, however, as he defines it as the act of throwing out, the state of being thrown out. J.A.H. Murray, in the Oxford Dictionary of 1897, quotes G. Coles, 1692 to 1732, as having used the term in a rather more modern sense, a turning of one's thoughts upon outward objects. Emile Lazarus, in his book Love versus Marriage, which was published in 1852 in New York, speaks of introversion, the turning inward of the being to act against himself. The habit of introverted thoughts has very morbid tendencies and incapacitates us from appreciating the real values and beauties that surround us. And in 1899, W.D. Whitney in his Century Dictio. Theory making, correlational and experimental psychology. 13. Neri defined introversion as the act of introverting, or the state of being introverted, turning or directing inward, physical or mental. Thus the terms themselves were current long before Jung's book appeared, and they were used with a meaning not too dissimilar to that which they have now assumed, which is very different from what they assume in Jung psychology. This is inevitably a very brief and summary sketch, but it will give the reader a feeling for the historical roots of our present-day concepts in this field, as well as illustrating the manifold influences which have been brought to bear on it. The development of the concept of extroversion has the aspects of a typical dot paradigm, growing in extent, in rigor, in sophistication, in acceptability, but without losing its original meaning and identity. Galen and Kant would have recognized our present-day concept as having grown out of their own observations and arising. So would Wundt and Gross, Heymans and McDougall. This link with history is important in a science which thrives on fads which are here today and gone tomorrow, not thus our paradigms created. 1.3 Theory making, correlational and experimental psychology. The general theory dealt with in this book has two separate but intertwined strands, the first descriptive, and based on factor analytic arguments and demonstrations, the second causal, and based on experimental tests of deductions from the theory. Both aspects have generated large numbers of empirical studies, bureaus. 8th Mental Measurements Yearbook lists. Over 700 studies using just one of the ISIN questionnaires, and on the department files there are some 5,000 reprints relevant to the theory. However, there are many questions attaching to the attempts made to support or disprove aspects of the theory, and it seemed important to discuss some of these questions in this section. We shall deal with both descriptive and causal theories, but before going into details it may be useful to discuss briefly the posy. Tie taken here concerning what Cronbach, 1957, has called the two disciplines of scientific psychology. The term refers to correlational studies, concerned with individual differences, and experimental studies, concerned with general laws. Cronbach makes the point that these two disciplines have in the past had little to do with each other, but that without active cooperation between them no scientific psychology is possible. The two disciplines complement each other and each needs the support of the other. This view has been strongly endorsed by the present author, Eysenck 1967, who makes two major points. The first point is that correlational psychology cannot in the nature of things come up with objective, universally agreed dimensions or categories. There are innumerable, mathematically equivalent ways of rotating factors, for instance, and no statistical magic key, not even simple structure, can close the door on alternative solutions. Psychological theories generate correlational studies, and sometimes the other way round. These studies can refine and partly disprove the original theories, leading to further and better correlational studies. The process is infinite, but it also hides an infinite regress. Alternative solutions and rotations are in principle, and usually in practice, not only possible but also appeal to different people. Factors shade into each other, as do concepts. There are no clear-cut dividing lines. Even the distinction between first-order, second-order, and higher-order factors is relative to the selection of original items or tests. There is no fundamental hierarchy determining the level of different concepts once and for all. The failure of factor analysts to come up with an agreed solution to the problem of what and how many primary factors is a case in point. If a method is as objective as adherents often claim, then in the 50 years since its inception one would have expected a more apparent consensus. The final factors never completely escape the shad of the initial selection of items or tests, or the selection of methods of extraction and rotation. Eysenck and Eysenck 1969. Even in the much better researched field of intelligence, there are still controversies about the need for a general factor, G, with some psychologists. 14. General features of the model. Like Guilford, for instance, preferring a solution solely in terms of a large number of primary factors. Guilford's solution is in my view not reconcilable with the data he himself has provided, but the general preference of many American psychologists for some solution eliminating G cannot be so easily dismissed. Eysenck 1979a. The crucial failure in all this work is of course the lack of any causal hypotheses. Purely correlational studies are inevitably circular, and only the incorporation of measures external to the circle, and linked with theories concerning the causation of the factors hypothesized, can take us outside the circulus viciosus. It is for this reason that I have laid such emphasis on theories linking arousal, as a reticular formation, neocortex loop, with extroversion-introversion. If it is feasible to deduce all the observed phenomena from such an hypothesis, and predict others, not yet observed, then clearly we have left behind the difficulties associated with a purely correlational approach. The contribution here of experimental psychology is vital, in that it provides us with the concepts in terms of which to phrase such causal theories. The concept of arousal derives from laboratory studies of experimental psychologists and physiologists, although early theoreticians like Gross were already searching for some such concept as implied by their observational data. It is of course not impossible that the crucial concept identifying the causal element might be generated independently of experimental psychology, but the probability of this happening is not perhaps very high. It should perhaps be said at this point that in asserting that correlational psychology has need of concepts and methods of experimental psychology, there is no attempt to downgrade the importance and value of correlational studies and multivariate analyses. Cattell 1966. Experimentalists in the narrow sense often look down with scorn on the users of correlational methods, considering this in some sense as an inferior method to that of functional analysis. This is a curious misconception. Even in physics, it is becoming realized that statistical concepts and methods are fundamental for any but the grossest action sequences under investigation. Sequences embodying millions and trillions of separate entities, and even their fundamental discoveries owe their existence to the simple observation of correlations. The discovery of Hubble's law, for instance, which is absolutely fundamental to modern cosmology, is based on the observation of a correlation observed by him between the distance and velocity of recession from the Earth of different galaxies. In spite of some still persisting doubts as to whether the Doppler effect which is used in this correlation is of truly cosmological significance, no physicist would doubt the importance of Hubble's work, in spite of its reliance on the despised correlation coefficient. However, it would be wrong to think of the relation between correlational and experimental psychology as consisting entirely in contributions made by the latter to the former. As remarked before, the relation is one of complementariness, and our second point therefore is that in most cases experimental psychology cannot function properly without reliance on the results of correlational psychology. The reason is simply that psychology studies the behavior of organisms, and these organisms react differentially to identical stimuli. The differences observed may be merely quantitative, e.g. that some of Pavlov's dogs condition very quickly and strongly, others very slowly and weakly. This by itself would be of the utmost importance to any theory of conditioning, or to its application to social functioning. Often, however, the differences are qualitative, i.e. some people, e.g. introverts, react in ways that are the exact opposite to that in which other people, e.g. extroverts, react. When this happens, disregard of such personality differences by the experimental psychologist will lead to the variance due to them being accumulated in the error term, which is thus typically swollen out of all recognition, until it swamps, as it too frequently does, all the main effects variance. One example must suffice to illustrate this effect. Others will be found throughout the rest of the book. Since Urbanschutzer's 1883 original work on intersensory facilitation, there has been a considerable body of experimentation indicating that the stimulation of one sensory receptor can facilitate the perception of stimuli. Theory making, correlational and experimental psychology. 15. In some other sensory area, presumably through an increase in the arousal level. However, many of the results reported have been quite divergent and contradictory, and no generally tenable conclusions have emerged. Recent work has been concerned with the parameters involved in this effect, such as the intensity of the heteromodal stimulus, but there has been an almost complete lack of concern with personality diff Ferences, and most writers have concluded that the effect can be either facilitatory or inhibitory, or presumably non-existent, a conclusion reminiscent of much of what passes as experimental psychology, and completely unenlightening. Shigezer and Simmons, 1973 A. B. Shigezer et al. 1973, used the personality dimension of extroversion-introversion to reconcile apparent contradictions. Their argument proceeds on the basis of two assumptions. The first makes use of the well-known inverted U relation between drive, arousal, and performance. This is similar to Pavlov's two laws of strength. An increase in stimulation will produce an increase in response, and transmarginal inhibition. Beyond a certain point, further increases in stimulation will produce increasing inhibition to protect the neurons against possible damage. Thus the first stage postulates that as heterosensory stimulation increases from a very low level, there will at first be facilitation of the perception of stimuli in the other modality, but that after an optimal point is reached, there will be inhibition. There is much evidence in the literature for some such generalization, but we now come to the crucial second stage of the argument, which states that introverts, having higher levels of arousal to begin with, will reach this optimal stage sooner than ambiverts, and these will reach it earlier than extroverts, who start out with a particular low level of arousal. This is a perfectly clear prediction, which was tested by submitting 10 extroverts, 10 ambiverts, and 10 introverts to an experiment in which auditory thresholds were measured under conditions in which illumination was varied in intensity in 10 stages. The predicted effect is shown in Figure 1.3, and perusal of the original paper will show that the results were precisely as anticipated. The phenomenon was capable of replication, and their high threshold, low threshold, A, E, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Intensity of light, 7, 8, 9, 10. Figure 1.3. Predicted change in auditory thresholds of introverts, ambiverts, and extroverts with change in the intensity of ambient illumination. Procedure could be reversed, i.e. varying auditory stimulation while measuring visual thresholds, with equal results. The study shows clearly that only by designing the experiment with both experimental parameters, intensity of stimuli, and personality parameters, extroversion-introversion, in mind, as well as a usable theory of the regression of the phenomenon on arousal can we hope to achieve reproducible, meaningful results. As I have tried to argue elsewhere, and have illustrated with many examples, this is the usual kind of result when experimentalists take seriously their duty to look at the nature of the organism studied, as well as the parameters of the experimental situation, Eysenck 1976a. Arousal is such an important variable in most psychological experiments that it may be said almost axiomatically that there can be few studies in experimental psychology which would not benefit by having the extroversion-introversion dimension controlled and used as either a main effect or more frequently as responsible for an interaction effect, Eysenck 1967. In using personality variables in this interactive and integrative fashion, however, there are many problems and difficulties which it may be useful to mention and briefly discuss at this point. The first has already been mentioned, namely the prevalence of curvilinear regressions as far as arousal, and hence extroversion intro. General features of the model. 22. T. L. 0. Dot tilde. 0. E. C. Colon E. 20. 18. 16. 14. 12. I. 2. I. 4. Stimulus intensity. I. B. I. 16. Figure 1.4. Mean AEP, averaged evoked potential, amplitude for low and high disinhibition scorers, introverts and extroverts, at different levels of stimulus intensity. After Zuckerman et al. 1974. Version is concerned. The large literature on the Yukas-Dudson law, the Pavlovian laws of strength and transmarginal inhibition, and the inverted U function shows the great and almost universal tendency for increases in responses as a function of increases in stimulation to be self-limiting. Figure 1.4 shows the results of an experiment using the AEP, averaged evoked potential, as a function of intensity of visual stimulation. There are 5 levels of stimulus intensity, and the personality variable measured was disinhibition, which is correlated with extroversion. It will be seen that, as in the Shigeshiza studies, there is a linear regression in the high disinhibition, extrovert, group, and a curvilinear regression in the low disinhibition, introverted, group. Quite probably the linear regression would come down too if the intensity were increased by another factor of 2. Corcoran, 1965, has put forward several arguments to indicate the usefulness of the curvilinear relationship and its correlation with extroversion-introversion for experimental studies. He states, quite rightly, that the inverted U relationship has been used rather loosely, in that some, e.g. Hebb 1955, Marmo 1959, Duffy 1949, have used the relation as an aid to theory, while others, e.g. Freeman 1940, Kortz 1942, Schlossberg 1954, Stennett 1957, have found that the relation fits their data. As he points out, the assumption is, however, loose and ill-defined, since with a U function direct prediction of the value on one axis from knowledge of the other is not always possible. This difficulty arises from the fact that on such a curve, for any given value of performance except the optimal there will be 2 possible values of arousal, so that although level of performance is predictable given level of arousal cannot be ascertained merely from knowledge of performance. As figure 1.5 shows, this ambiguity can be resolved, however, by experimentally increasing or decreasing arousal level. The direction of change of performance will then indicate the location of the subject. C. V. E. Colon. 0. V2. 6 foot V3. 11. X2. Arousal. Figure 1.5. Performance level YI, Y3 would result from arousal levels 11 or X3. Given values Y1 or Y3, it is possible to determine whether arousal level is at 11 or X3 by manipulating level of arousal and noting directional change in performance. After Corcoran 1965. Theory making. Correlational and experimental psychology 17.1 tilde COE-.E tilde H.LLH arousal _ figure 1.6. Groups land H both perform at H. 1. By manipulating level of arousal, it is possible to determine which group is at H and which at L. After Corcoran 1965, on the abscissor. In a similar fashion, the position of two groups differing in personality, e.g. extroverts and introverts, on a performance variable can be identical, but their shift in performance when arousal level is increased or decreased will provide predictable shifts in performance. Figure 1.6 illustrates this contingency, and Corcoran provides experimental evidence to illustrate the use of personality variables in this manner. Other illustrations, using drugs, will be given in later chapters. A similar argument is put forward by Frith, 1967, who tested critical flicker fusion performance under conditions of quiet, low arousal, and noise, high arousal, predicting improvement under the noisy conditions for extroverts. And no change or decrement for introverts. Fig. U1.7 illustrates his prediction, and the experimental results were in line with expectation. The percentage of correct responses from quiet to noisy conditions rose from 52.64 to 58.56 for the extroverts, but remained almost identical for the introverts, 53.12 as opposed to 53.16. So far we have dealt with a curvilinear relation between drive or arousal, on the one hand, and performance on the other. There can be little doubt about the reality of such a curvilinear relation, but its causes are still unclear. There are numerous theories, ranging from Pavlov's notion of protective inhibition, i.e. inhibition, presumably on the receptor side, which protects the cortical neurons from overstimulation, to Easterbrook's notion of concentration of attention, accompanied by decrement in non-central perception and attention. Some of these theories will be referred to in later chapters, but it may be suggested that no firm theory has arisen to account for all instances of curvi. Linear regression, and that probably no single theory exists in this field. Different responses may be subject to different laws in this respect, requiring a separate theory for each class of responses. It is unfortunate that so little seems to have been done to clarify this issue. The problem has been with us for long enough. To complicate the picture even further, we have two additional but different types of curvilinear regression, implicating extroversion-introversion through the mediating variable, quiet noisy II1 tilde introverts, A. Times. Extroverts IVL, a figure 1.7. Hypothetical relationship between the extent of arousing factors, personality, and performance. After Frith 1967, 11 /E1 tilde. Backslash. 11 IE1I A1I or II or I1 extent of arousing factors. General features of the model. Extrovert. Introvert. CLI. E. Clio. Tilde. OE. CLI. L. CLI. E. CLI. 0. S2. Ole. Clio ZD CLI. L. Low. Sensory deprivation. Population average. Level of stimulation. Medium. High, pain. Figure 1.8. Relation between level of sensory input and hedonic tone as a function of personality. After Eysenck 1963. Arousal. The first of these regressions involves hedonic tone, rather than performance. Figure 1.8 illustrates the hypothesis, first stated by Eysenck, 1963. The hypothesis states, in the first place, that just as there is an optimal level of arousal for performance, so there is an optimal level of arousal for subjective feelings of contentment, happiness, or generally preferred hedonic tone. This level is intermediate between low arousal, such as might accompany sensory deprivation, and too high arousal, such as might accompany painful sensory stimulation. This hypothesis, originally introduced in a slightly different form by Wundt, 1874, is illustrated in figure 1.8 by the solid curved line. It is modified by the additional hypothesis that extroverts and introverts will show an optimum level of hedonic tone at points OLJ and OLE, displaced from the general average optimum level O.L.P of the population towards the lower and higher stimulation arousal ends of the abscissor respec. Tively. It follows from this hypothesis that at points A and B, where the hedonic tone is indifferent for the average, ambivert, person, introverts and extroverts will have respectively negative and positive hedonic feelings. It also follows that extroverts will have higher pain thresholds. E.g. Xiaomi 1978, while introverts will find sensory deprivation easier to bear, Eysenck 1967. Both these predictions have been shown to be experimentally verifiable, Eysenck 1976a. This hypothesis is clearly different from that linking arousal and performance, but it should be noted that it is quite possible that hedonic tone itself will influence performance, in the sense that performance itself, by changing a person's arousal level, will become a positive or negative reinforcement, and hence produce motivation either to continue or discontinue the performance of the act in question. Conversely, performance, by affecting the arousal level, may lead to actions which may change the arousal level. Thus Ashton et al., 1972, have shown that under boring work conditions, under arousal, people will smoke more than under moderately arousing conditions. Similarly, they will smoke under difficult work conditions, over arousal, more than under moderately arousing condi. Tie-ins. Smoking has arousing or tranquilizing effects, depending on dosage, Eysenck 1979b. These interactions should always be borne in mind when planning experiments in this field, or analyzing experimental results. Thus Tranel, 1961, studied 20 introverts and 20 extroverts. Theory making, correlational and experimental psychology. 19. Under conditions of perceptual isolation and found that as a group extroverts tolerated the isolation conditions significantly better than introverts in terms of time spent in the room. This result is completely contrary to what was expected. However, Tranel also discovered the reasons for this apparent failure. Subjects had been instructed to lie quietly on their couch, to estimate the time every half hour and not to go to sleep. In general, the extroverts reacted by ignoring the instructions, while the introverts reacted by adhering rigidly to instructions. As Tranel reports, the extroverts largely ignored the instructions to lie quietly. They moved about quite freely, and this movement was part of their coping behavior. In other words, extroverts resorted to a form of self-stimulation in the form of tapping, moving, or exploration of the surroundings. They seemed to be much more concerned with devising ways to endure the situation than with following the instructions. This may be interpreted as negative hedonic tone, much stronger in extroverts than introverts in this situation, motivating extroverts to increase arousal level by going counter to the instructions. The strong motivational properties of hedonic tone must therefore always be borne in mind in experiments involving arousal. An alternative hypothesis to the one illustrated in Figure 1.8 is of course that extroverts and introverts differ with respect to the optimal level of arousal, with extroverts preferring a higher level than introverts. The available evidence, though not sufficient to establish the original hypothesis as definitively superior, does not suggest that this alternative hypothesis is preferable. An experiment to test these two hypotheses against each other would be necessary before coming to any final decision, and no such experiment has thus far been reported. It is of course not impossible that both hypotheses may be true and complementary, rather than antagonistic. Extroverts may prefer a higher level of arousal, as well as being chronically low on arousal, as compared with introverts. However, while there is much evidence, as we shall see, for the latter statement, there is none for the former, and provisionally, therefore, we shall retain the original hypothesis. A final possibility which must be considered is related to the concept of arousal potential introduced by Beline, 1974. This may be said to denote what he calls correlative properties of stimuli, but has probably a much wider application to all types of stimuli which produce arousal or disarousal. Such stimuli may be called external sources of arousal potential. Internal sources of arousal potential are such personality factors as may be related to arousal, i.e. primarily extroversion-introversion. The question which now arises is whether there is a linear relation between arousal potential and arousal, accompanied by a curvilinear relation between arousal and performance, or whether there is already a curvilinear relation between arousal potential and arousal, which might, in Pavlov's phrase, protect the organism against too high an arousal. If this were true, then the observed inversely relation between arousal and performance might in part be an artifact due to lower arousal being produced by higher arousal potential conditions in the descending limb of the U-shaped relation between arousal potential and arousal. This rather confusing hypothesis is illustrated in Figure 1.9, Eysenck and O'Connor 1979, which related arousal potential to a direct measure of arousal, namely the CNV, contingent negative variation on the EEG. The arousal potential in this case was constituted by internal G.NV. Arousal potential. Figure 1.9. Contingent negative variation, a measure of cortical arousal, as a function of arousal potential. Internal sources of arousal potential, extroversion and introversion. External sources of arousal potential, RS, real smoking, as opposed to SS, sham smoking. 20. General features of the model. Factors, extroversion versus introversion, and an external factor, sham smoking versus real smoking, with the latter constituting the arousal increasing factor. The figure shows the theoretical prediction, compared with the sham smoking condition, which shows extroverts having lower arousal than introverts. Real smoking produces a shift upwards for the extroverts, but a shift downwards for the introverts. The outcome of the experiment, which will be described in more detail in a later chapter, was in line with prediction. Thus there seems to be some truth in the hypothesis linking arousal potential to actual arousal in a curvilinear fashion. The notion of these several and distinct curvilinear relations between arousal potential, performance and hedonic tone is confusing, but if reality is complex it serves no useful purpose to pretend otherwise, and the evidence for all the relationships observed is quite strong. Further research into all of them is obviously required, as is further work on the relation obtaining between these curvilinear relations and personality. However, there is one supremely important consequence that follows from this discussion, and it is that theories linking personality with performance must always specify the parameters under which the relationship is to be tested. Clearly, if curvilinear relationships are the rule rather than the exception, then correlations between a given personality trait, e.g. extroversion, and a given type of performance may be positive or negative, depending on the part of the U-shaped curve linking the two. There is so much evidence concerning this point, e.g. Eysenck 1967, 1976a, which will be raised again ~ND again in the course of this book, that experimentalists can have no excuse for disregarding it in designing their experiments or interpreting their findings. The Shigezer et al. Experiments already described are a clear example. For low intensities of visual stimulation, the relation between introversion and auditory threshold is the opposite to that which can be observed at higher intensities. Another example is the work of Eysenck and Levy, 1972, on eye blink conditioning with strong and weak UCS. The correlation with introversion is positive for weak stimuli, negative for strong stimuli, as predicted. A personality theory cannot be regarded as acceptable unless it predicts the parameter values under which certain relations are to be found. Such predictions may not always be quantitative prior to investigations of the precise point at which the optimal levels on a given curvilinear relationship are to be found, but at least some relative prediction should always be possible, phrased perhaps in terms of more or less, stronger or weaker. Many alleged failures of the theory discussed in this book have been produced by the experimenters' failures to take seriously the requirements of the theory to specify parameter values. In the absence of such statements, the results of experiments are not interpretable. The outcome of this section is thus that theory making in the personality field cannot proceed without taking into account the concepts of experimental psychology, such as arousal, and the findings of experimental psychology, such as the inverted U relation between arousal, drive, and performance. Conversely, the findings of correlational psychology in the personality field are directly relevant to the testing of theories in the experimental field, and the inclusion of such directly relevant personality variables, e.g. extroversion-introversion, is not just permissible, but mandatory. Theories should combine personality and experimental variables in making predictions, and should pay particular attention to the specification of the parameter values expected to produce a given type of interaction. Without such specification, theories cannot properly be said to be supported or disproved. There are many other difficulties and problems in making proper predictions and testing personality theories. Some of these will be discussed in the next section. But these, although important, are less fundamental than the problem posed by the specification of parameter values, particularly the intensity and duration of stimuli. 1.4.1 Theory testing, constraints and complications. Given that our theory has been stated in a testable form, we are still faced with a number of problems, some of which are part of their theory making, correlational and experimental psychology. 21. Philosophy of science and are common to all models, others of which are more specific to the particular model under consideration. We shall deal briefly with the more general problems, then in greater detail with the more specific ones. Both verificationist and falsificationist theories in the scientific demarcation dispute already alluded to in the first section have given rise to difficulties. We can verify a particular deduction from a particular theory, but this is clearly not enough to verify the theory as such. Many other deductions could have been made, and some of these might have disproved the theory. A theory, accordingly, can never be proved to be right, and as Popper has pointed out, all theories in fact are likely to be proved wrong in the end. Falsification of a theory is also difficult, however, because a theory is always only one of two or more premises in a logical argument. If the deduction is falsified, it could always be because the other premises involved are wrong, rather than the theory in question. Both these possibilities must be borne in mind when considering the evidence for and against a given theory. As an example, consider Eysenck's theory relating extroversion to pursuit rotor reminiscence, Eysenck and Frith 1977. Accepting the Hullian notion of dissipation of inhibition as an explanation of the phenomenon, it was argued that extroverts, generating more inhibition, should show greater reminiscence. During a prolonged effort to verify this deduction and quantify the theory, in the course of which over 50 separate experiments were carried out and reported, there was overwhelming support for the superiority of extroverts in pursuit rotor reminiscence, yet the theory was in fact false. As could be shown quite clearly when another deduction was tested, namely that differences in reminiscence between extroverts and introverts should be apparent pre-rest, with rest restoring a quality of performance. What was found was the opposite. Differences appeared post-rest, with equal performance pre-rest. Apparently the Hullian formulation was an error, and an alternative